We're actually doing a big iPhone 12 giveaway, link in the description to find out more. Right, back to the video. So PS5 or Xbox Series X, which one should you guys get? We've actually done an incredibly detailed comparison video back in July, a complete buyer's guide, which was extremely well received by you guys. That video is close to 1 million views and over 16,000 likes. So, thank you. And now that we know the UI, the prices, the ports, and all the backwards compatibility details, and pretty much all the other details, I wanted to give you guys a final buyer's guide, an updated buyer's guide. So in this video, I'll be covering the design, the controller, the specs, the UI, the games, the graphics, special features, backwards compatibility, and finally, price, to help you decide which console you should get. And spoiler, honestly, all of these consoles are really, really good. The final decision will be based on the games that you play and the people that you play with. But for all of you who want all the juicy details, well, this is the video for you. So get the snacks ready, sit back, relax, and enjoy. So starting off with the design, these consoles could not be more black and white. Literally, the PS5 is white and the Xbox Series X is black, but aside from the colors, they do have a completely different design too. So the Xbox has a more classic look with this box style design, hence, its name, whereas the PS5 looks quite a bit more unique. Personally, I do actually like both, but there's no denying that a PS5 will stand out much more in a living room, whereas the Xbox Series X will blend in better. Another difference design-wise is in terms of the size. The PS5 is much taller than the Xbox Series X is, and while you can indeed put both in horizontal mode too, the Xbox will still have a smaller footprint. So if you don't have a lot of space in your living room, and you want something that doesn't stand out as much, then the Xbox is a better choice. Speaking of changing the orientation, on the Xbox side, it's pretty straightforward. You just flip the console and you're good to go. Now, the PS5 actually comes with a built-in stand, which you can attach to either the bottom or the side of the console and prop it up that way. The PS5 also has LED strips towards the top part of the console, which will change their color depending on the state that the console is in. Definitely giving you that RGB gaming look, which I'm actually a big fan of. Now the Xbox, on the other hand, doesn't have any fancy bells and whistles when it comes to the design. Now, something that you should know is that there are two models of each of these consoles. So the PS5 has the regular PS5 and then the digital edition of the PS5, whereas the Xbox has the Xbox Series X and the Xbox Series S. Now on the PS5 side, both models look very similar. The only difference here is that the digital edition doesn't have a Blu-ray drive and therefore it has a more uniform design, whereas the regular PS5 has this bulge on its side, which makes it look, well, not quite as nice. However, performance-wise, both models of the PS5 are identical. More about that in just a bit. On the Xbox side, the Series X is the one that we talked about before. The Series S is crazy small. It is even smaller and thinner than the Xbox One S. It also comes in white, which I think looks really, really nice, and it also lacks a disk drive, so this is also a digital version of the Xbox Series X. However, the Series S is actually not quite as powerful as the Series X is. More about that when we get to the performance section of this video. But yeah, let me know in the comments which design out of these four do you actually like the most. Moving on to the controllers, these two could not be more black and white either. And yes, that's because again, the PS5 controller is white and the Xbox controller is black. But aside from the colors, there are actually quite a ton of differences between these two controllers. So the DualSense, which is the PS5's controller, is now bigger and fatter than the PS4 controller in order to make it more comfortable. So it now looks more similar in terms of the form factor to the Xbox controller. Now, the biggest difference between these two controllers, in my opinion, is that the joysticks are symmetrical on the PS5 controller, whereas on the Xbox controller, they're asymmetrical. I personally prefer symmetrical joysticks, but some of you might say that the Xbox joysticks are more comfortable. Now, a big advantage to the PS5 controller is that it now features an advanced haptic engine, hence its name. So according to this, you'll be able to feel the difference between certain surfaces in a game, stuff like ice, mud, grass, and so on. The Xbox controller will require separate batteries to work, which I'm not a big fan of, whereas the PS5 controller will have a built-in rechargeable battery. Now, you can, however, buy the Xbox Play and Charge kit, but it costs extra. The PS5 controller also has a touchpad for interacting with some games using touch, and you can also use this in the UI as a mouse and also when typing on a keyboard, which is pretty cool. The PS5 controller also has adaptive triggers, which can adjust their pressure based on the game. So you'll actually be able to feel different guns and games actually firing very differently. The Xbox controller uses impulse triggers, which vibrate independently from the controller to give you a better immersion. And the PS5 controller also has a built-in microphone on top of the already built-in speaker, meaning that you can actually use your TV's speakers and still have voice chat with your friends without the need of a headset. They both have a headphone jack for connecting your own headphones easily, and they both have a dedicated share button. However, you can probably tell that a PS5 controller has way more features and way more bells and whistles, whereas the Xbox controller is an improved version of the very well-praised Xbox One controller. Now, something that the Xbox controller does have over the PS5 controller is dynamic latency input. Microsoft claims that they managed to reduce the input latency of the controller, which could result in a competitive advantage over PS5 gamers in online games. Therefore, if you're a competitive player, the Xbox controller could actually offer you an advantage over PS5 players in games such as Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, for example. But in every other way, it seems that the PS5 controller does indeed offer you more. Okay, moving on to the specs, which of these consoles is actually more powerful? Well, specs-wise, these consoles are actually very similar, as they both feature a custom-made AMD CPU and a custom-made AMD GPU. And that is an 8-core AMD Zen 2 CPU and an AMD RDNA 2 GPU. Now, the Xbox can actually boost up to 3.8 GHz, while the PS5 can boost up to 3.5 GHz. Not only that, but while the Xbox's CPU frequency will actually stay at 3.8 GHz, so that's a constant frequency, the PS5's frequency is variable, which means that it can go up to 3.5 GHz, but it can also be lower depending on the ambient temperature around your PlayStation, and also the GPU usage. So CPU alone, the Xbox Series X is more powerful. Now, I did mention that the digital version of the PS5 has the exact same specs as the regular PS5 does. However, the Xbox Series S is indeed inferior to the Xbox Series X. So, CPU-wise, the Series S has the same CPU as the Series X, but it can only boost to up to 3.6 GHz. Interesting enough, this is still higher than the PS5's clock speed. Right, GPU-wise, the Xbox Series X has a custom-made AMD RDNA 2 GPU with 52 compute units at 1.825 GHz, while the PS5 also has a custom AMD RDNA 2 GPU, but with 36 compute units at 2.23 GHz. The compute units are essentially the cores of a GPU, so to say. Some games prefer more cores at a lower frequency, other games prefer fewer cores at a higher frequency, and it seems like Sony decided to go for fewer cores, but at a higher frequency here. Now, in terms of the raw GPU performance, the Series X has 12.16 teraflops, while the PS5 has 10.28. So there is a 1.88 teraflop difference between the two consoles, which is quite significant. Just to give you guys an idea, the Xbox One X had 6 teraflops, the PS4 Pro had 4.2 teraflops, and in pretty much all cross-platform games, the Xbox One X has been able to run at a higher resolution while also maintaining a higher frame rate. And this is likely to be the case again with the PS5 and the Xbox Series X. Now, the Xbox Series S's GPU, on the other hand, this one has 20 compute units at 1.56 GHz for a total of 4 teraflops. Now, this actually makes it look weaker than the Xbox One X, which had 6 teraflops of GPU compute power, but keep in mind that this is also a much newer architecture. It's RDNA 2, and we cannot really compare the two consoles side by side. Now, RAM-wise, the PS5 has 16 GB of GDDR6 memory, and same goes for the Xbox Series X. The Series S, however, has 10 GB. Now, when it comes to the memory bandwidth, the PS5 has 448 gigabytes per second for the entire 16 gigabyte chunk of memory, whereas the Xbox Series X has 560 gigabytes per second, but only for the first 10 gigabytes of memory. And then 336 gigabytes per second for the remaining 6 gigabytes of memory. When it comes to the storage, the PS5 has 825 gigabytes of custom NVMe storage, with speeds of up to 5.5 gigabytes per second. This is up from 50 megabytes per second on the PS4 Pro. whereas the Xbox Series X has 1 terabyte of a custom NVMe drive once again, but with slower speeds of up to 2.4 gigabytes per second. The Series S has the same storage speeds, but we only get 512 gigabytes of storage. What this means is that the PS5 games will actually load faster, and assets will also load quicker as well. And technically, Sony could also use this storage as RAM and therefore match the Xbox Series X in terms of raw performance, in theory at least, so we'll have to wait and see until we get some actual cross-platform games and then compare the two and see if we get any major differences. Now, all of these consoles will allow you to upgrade the storage, but the way you can do that is actually quite a bit different. So Microsoft will be selling this $200 1 terabyte Seagate expansion card, but with Sony, you'll be able to buy any NVMe drive from Amazon that matches that 5.5 gigabyte per second internal speed of the storage, and you can install that yourself quite easily. Now, there is actually one drive available already, the WD Black SN850, which costs $150 for 500 gigabytes, to $30 for 1 terabyte, and $450 for 2 terabytes. Link in the description, by the way, in case you want to buy one. Now, another difference between these two consoles, performance-wise, is when it comes to cooling. The Xbox Series X uses a vapor chamber, an active fan, as well as a heatsink to keep the temperatures down. The PS5, on the other hand, uses liquid metal as a thermal paste. It does not have a vapor chamber, but it does have a gigantic fan and a massive heatsink, which according to Sony, can achieve the same performance as a vapor chamber. Again, we'll have to wait and see if that's really true. Now, the PS5 is also much bigger than the Xbox Series X is, so we could, in theory, see some improved thermals here, but again, we'll have to wait and see. Now, the Xbox Series S does not have a vapor chamber, but it does have an active fan and this black cutout that we can see here, which is actually for the cooling rather than it being a disk drive or anything like that. Okay, next up we have the UI. So both of the UIs have been revealed. This is how the Xbox Series X's UI looks like, and this is how the PS5's UI looks like. Now, the Xbox UI looks very similar to the Xbox One X's UI, while the PS5's UI is brand new. Both feature a grid-style UI with focus on not just the games, but also on what your friends are doing, the latest news and activities surrounding the game that you're currently playing, and achievements and trophies and all that being perfectly visible. Now, unfortunately, it has been confirmed that the Xbox UI actually runs at 1080p, even on a 4K or an 8K TV, whereas obviously the PS5's UI, it runs at 4K and then upscales to 8K if you have an 8K TV. Apparently, Microsoft did this because of that new quick resume feature, which needs more RAM. And yeah, I think this just sucks. Like, I don't know. I have a Nintendo Switch and I have 4K TV, and the UI on the Switch looks pretty bad. 1080p on a 4K TV, and it's pretty sad to see that the next gen console for Microsoft will basically have the same quality in terms of the UI as a Nintendo Switch does. Hopefully that gets fixed in a future software update, but other than that, both UIs look pretty good. I do like both, but I don't know, I just feel like they're both a bit too cluttered now when compared to something like the PS4's UI. I think that was the cleanest UI, but let me know in the comments, what do you guys think in terms of the UI? And also subscribe if you're at it. If you want to see more in-depth tech videos like this one, hopefully is. As you know, it's free to subscribe, so why not? Moving on to games, this is where it gets really interesting. And that's because up until the last video that we did, it was basically something like this. On the Xbox, you can play any game from the current or previous generation, as well as play brand new Xbox Series X games on the older consoles. Just like on PC, basically, no matter what specs you have, you can still play your games, just at a lower or better quality depending on those specs. And Microsoft was not going to have any exclusive games for the first 2 years. Now, Sony, on the other hand, was going to have actual exclusives. And the reasoning for this was that if you're developing a game for just one system, you can obviously optimize that game much better and achieve significantly better results in terms of the graphics. Now, unfortunately, Sony has actually confirmed that most PS5 games will actually still work on the PS4, including Spider-Man Miles Morales. Therefore, the only big PS5 exclusive games that we're aware of at the moment is Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart and Gran Turismo 7, and well, that's pretty much it. Everything else, including Horizon Forbidden West, will also be available on the PS4. Microsoft doesn't really have any exclusives at launch, and most games that we will be getting on the Xbox Series X will be cross-platform games such as Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Cyberpunk, and so on. Now, Flight Simulator 2020, this one will be, I believe, the very first big exclusive game on the Xbox, and this will come in 2021, same goes for Halo. So, long story short, the majority of games that will be available at launch on both of these consoles will actually be playable on both, with major exclusives only launching in 2021 or even 2022. With Horizon, Forbidden West, and God of War as the biggest franchises on the Sony side, and Halo and Fable being one of the biggest on the Xbox side. PS5 will be getting Spider-Man Miles Morales at launch, which again, this will also work on the PS4, and then Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, which will be an exclusive to just the PS5, as the PS4 storage is just too slow to drive the game's unique Rift functionality. So what about the graphics now? Which console will have better looking games? Well, obviously we can only compare cross-platform games here, as exclusives won't be coming out on both consoles until 2021. But when it comes to cross-platform games, Black Ops Cold War will actually run at native 4K and at 120 frames per second on both of these consoles. Yes, both consoles support up to 120 frames per second in some games, and even 8K 60 support as well. But it doesn't really mean that you'll be able to play games at 8K. Maybe some smaller indie games might actually support it, or at least some UI elements will be displayed in 8K if you have an 8K TV, but other than that, 4K is basically the high-end 120 of this generation. However, even though both consoles support 4K at 120, you will need an HDMI 2.1 capable TV. We've actually done a video on the very best TV that you can buy for the PS5 and the Xbox Series X right here. Now, if you don't have an HDMI 2.1 capable TV, you'll still be able to play at 120 frames per second, just not in 4K. Like 1080p and 1440p, they'll work, depending on your TV. Now, the Xbox Series S will also be able to play at up to 120 frames per second, but only up to 1440p. So this is why the GPU is way more powerful on the Xbox Series X. As we can do 4K at 120, whereas the Series S can only do 1440p at 120, and you do need significantly less GPU power to do that. Also, Microsoft has been promoting 120 frames per second heavily, whereas Sony hasn't really been doing that, even though the PS5 does actually support 120 frames per second. In fact, the brand new Spider-Man Miles Morales will actually run at 4K 30 with ray tracing on the PS5. Now, if you disable ray tracing, it will run at 60. But it seems like the Xbox might be able to do both at the same time. Now, when it comes to special features, the biggest one, in my opinion, is Game Pass on the Xbox. This allows you to pay a monthly fee of just £8 and have access to over 100 massive games, such as Forza, Halo, Doom Eternal, and so many more. Not only that, but you can also play all of those games on PC too. So with Xbox Game Pass, you also get access to Age of Empires 3 Definitive Edition, Microsoft Flight Sim 2020, and so much more on PC. And you can even play all of these games directly on your smartphone too, with an Xbox controller as well, which is really nuts. Now, Sony does have PlayStation Now, but you cannot download all the games. You'll have to stream them, which means that the quality just won't be as good, and new games won't actually be available on the PS Now until a few years after release. So Game Pass is really superior to PlayStation Now. Now, both consoles feature Quick Resume, where you can instantly switch between multiple apps or games open in the background, and both consoles do support 3D audio. However, Sony will be launching a first-party headset just for that, on top of some more first-party accessories such as a PS5 camera. The PS5 will also support the PSVR headset, with a PSVR 2 coming around 2021 or 2022 according to the leaks. Now, Xbox doesn't really have any VR support, unfortunately, which I think really sucks. I think that's a missed opportunity on Microsoft's end. The PS5 also has Wi-Fi 6, which, interesting enough, the Xbox Series X actually lacks. Wi-Fi 6 is really for future-proofing, as it can not only deliver twice the speeds of Wi-Fi 5, so up to 9.6 gigabits per second, up from 3.5, but it also helps decongest your network if you already have a Wi-Fi 6 router. Link to a good one in the description box down below, by the way. Now, something interesting to note is when it comes to the ports. So the PS5 has a USB Type-C port and a USB Type-A port on the front, and then two more USB Type-A ports on the back. And all the ports, with the exception of the USB Type-A port on the front, support 10 gigabit per second speeds, or up to 1.25 gigabytes per second. The Xbox Series X has 3 USB Type-A ports, 1 on the front, 2 on the back, but unfortunately all of these are only 5 gigabit per second ports, or up to 625 megabytes per second. You'll see why this actually matters once we get to the next section, which is backwards compatibility. So all of these consoles will be able to play games from obviously the current generation, but also the previous generation. However, there are a few differences here too. So if you have the digital-only version of either of these consoles, you will not be able to play the previous gen disc-based games. And while the PS5 will indeed support almost all PS4 games, the Xbox Series X will also support Xbox 360 games, as well as a few select original Xbox games on top of Xbox One games. Now, you can actually use an external hard drive or an external SSD on both of these consoles, but only for previous gen titles, as the new games will be optimized to take full advantage of that fast internal storage. And because of this, if you plan on buying an external M.2 enclosure, the PS5 will actually be able to take better advantage of those speeds. SATA-based SSDs and hard drives will work at the same speed on both of these consoles. Now, aside from just being able to play older gen games, all of these consoles will also be able to run those games at a higher resolution and a higher frame rate. For example, Hitman 2 is confirmed to now run at a native 4K and at 60 frames per second on the Xbox Series X with no updates, and then Ghost of Tsushima is also confirmed to run at 4K 60 on the PS5. Okay, so in the end, which one should you guys get? Well, if you're looking for the best value in a console, then this is by far the Xbox Series S. Not only does it cost $300 or £250, which is actually less than an Apple Watch SE, which is nuts, but you can also play the same games as the Xbox Series X with ray tracing, up to 120 frames per second, 3D audio, all of that, quick resume, just in 1440p and 1080p rather than 4K and 8K. Not only that, but if you get Xbox All Access, you pay just £21 a month and you get the Xbox Series S for free, and Game Pass 2 with over 100 major games for free, which is just nuts. Like, that's such a good deal. Now, if you don't want a subscription and you're just looking at buying the consoles outright, then the PS5 Digital costs $400 or £360 in UK, followed by the PS5 at £500 or £450 in UK, and then the Xbox Series X at the same price. Between the Xbox Series X and the regular PS5, I would say the Xbox Series S is technically worth it more, as it is more powerful than the PS5. But then the PS5 has better exclusives, especially at launch, and more features when it comes to the controller and faster storage. And between the PS5 Digital and the Xbox Series S, I would personally go for the PS5 Digital, as it only costs $100 more than the Series S, but this is a fully fledged PS5, whereas the Xbox Series S is a downgrade from the Series X. But if you want to go for a subscription model, then again, Xbox All Access is overall an outstanding deal. At the end of the day, it really depends on which games you want to play and what platforms your friends are playing at the moment. With the Xbox, you can play with other Xbox users as well as PC users, whereas with PlayStation, you can only play with other PlayStation users. Now, of course, that cross-platform games such as Fortnite or Call of Duty, they do allow you to play against all the other platforms, so these are indeed exceptions to the rule, but if we're talking about non-cross-platform games, then PlayStation can only play with PlayStation, Xbox can play with Xbox and PC. But yeah, let me know in the comments which one would you go for and why, and definitely subscribe and hit the bell icon, turn on notifications if you have enjoyed this video and you want to see more in-depth tech videos like this one was. We'll be doing loads of coverage on the new Xbox, on the new PlayStation, so lots of videos on that, definitely stay tuned. Become a member if you want to support the channel by tapping on that join button down below. And this has been pretty much it. So thank you for watching, I'm Daniel, this has been ZONEofTECH, and I'll see you guys in the next one. ZONEofTECH, signing out. Cheers.